I will call our work session of September 13th to order, and we have a presentation and discussion of recommendations regarding Minnesota's new cannabinoid law. I will pass it to City Manager Katie Rodriguez. I'll pass it to Katie.
Thank you, Mayor. And just a reminder to everyone that we are using first names at work sessions. It'll take a little while for us to get used to it. I'm going to I will announce the titles at first. So Chief Henthorn and Jennifer Anderson, our Support Services Supervisor, are here to present on the new cannabinoid edibles law. Go ahead, Jay.
Thanks, Katie and Maria. It's actually taken me about 2 months to be able to pronounce that correctly. Edible cannabinoid products is what I usually refer to as ECPs. So you might hear that through our presentation. But I'll turn it over to Jennifer and we'll present what we know as of this date and the information that we've collected, and then recommendations for you as council to take a look at and give us some feedback on. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer Anderson, Support Services Supervisor.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. The chief mentioned tonight we're just going to talk briefly about, like he said, what we know today. He will present League of Minnesota City findings through the work group that he sat on. Some of the concerns from a city perspective that we have, options for the council to consider, and then our staff recommendations at the end. And then we hope to have a robust discussion and answer questions that we are capable of answering today. So who's got the clicker? Oh. All right. So in 2019, the legislature legalized the sale of certain products containing non-intoxicating cannabinoids that were extracted from hemp, commonly known as CBD products. And these products came on the market and were designed to provide pain relief, better sleep, improved appetite for people living with cancer, reducing inflammation, and so forth. So the legislature recently amended that law to specifically legalize certain edible cannabinoids, or ECPs, that are derived from hemp that contain a small amount of THC, which is the main psychoactive compound found in cannabis, and that's what gives you the high. The law now permits the sale of those products containing THC that are intended to be eaten and drank, commonly known as edibles. So these products may contain no more than 0.3% of THC, no more than 5 milligrams of THC per serving, and no more than 50 milligrams of THC per package. The law currently prohibits the sale of these products to anyone under the age of 21 and contains several requirements regarding labeling and packaging. The law does not address possession for those who are under 21. So the cities listed on this slide are kind of a current snapshot of what's happening right now in each of these municipalities. There's definitely more questions than answers. I think we're all talking to each other, finding out what everybody's doing, stances that they're taking, and why. The lack of guardrails around this is the main concern from most cities. And yeah, so this list is growing daily. So the chief will talk about the LMC work group now that he was a part of.
So the League of Minnesota Cities work group, we had 2 meetings. There were 29 people on the work group. I know City Attorney Mary Teachin was also part of the work group from the city attorney perspective. I was on the work group with 29 other cities to talk about this statute and what we needed to do as far as looking at licensing and some of the other things that came up. So the recommendations from the League of Minnesota Cities Delivery Policy Committee that we put forth to the league was to look at recommendations going forward, which includes a future discussion on regulatory framework of these products, because under the statute 151.72, there's not a lot of regulations. We're looking for a strong state regulatory framework for licensing, inspection, and enforcement for the cultivation, manufacture, and distribution to retailers. We're taking a look at that. Also, rigorous testing requirement needed. The state right now does not have a way to test edible cannabinoid products, ECPs. We don't have a way to test them out on the street. We have to use what we call a DRE, a drug recognition expert, which can come cumbersome because there's not a lot of them in the state. And then reporting and enforcement structure for law enforcement, including penalties for noncompliance, reporting and enforcement structure for local government to address any other issues. So the public safety needs that were brought up from the group are the state to prohibit the possession of cannabinoid products for those under 21. Obviously, no one under 21 can possess it. So how does that factor into any other criminal penalties? There are a lot of cities out there that are looking at petty misdemeanor citations for those that are in possession under 21, and under state statute, petty misdemeanor is not a crime. Other cities are looking at misdemeanors, and whether or not those are prosecuted by a city attorney, by a county attorney, and how that's handled. So also ongoing state resources and training for law enforcement to address costs of the public. And that's something that we have learned from Oregon and Colorado that was before us, looking at, how do we put regulations or guardrails, as Jennifer talked about, on this product. Those are some of the concerns. But also the resources for technology so law enforcement can test products, which I talked about. One thing that the other states had problems with regarding some of the guardrails was compliance, enforcement, regulations. Under Minnesota's law, it's the Board of Pharmacy that does the regulation. Unfortunately, they have a lot of complaints already. They have very few investigators, very few resources to go out and be able to do investigation. We're also concerned about products that are being shipped in from other states that under the state law can be done. We've been told by Oregon and Colorado the counterfeiting of products, the levels of THC, the harmful effects that cause is very high. We don't have any regulatory structure in place right now to be able to determine if those products are counterfeit, which was a big concern from some of the other states that occurred in. And so we're dealing with all that at this point. And at the same time, what do we do? So under some, I think I went one ahead. So the concerns, I talked about the regulatory structure, consumer protection. I've talked to a couple municipalities who have already had incidents of kids getting in touch with the products and almost overdosed on THC gummies. And so, how do we control that sale of those THC products? I talked about the Board of Pharmacy in enforcing regulations. And right now, we have a checklist that I can go out, or I can have our staff go out and determine whether or not someone's in compliance. And then that checklist goes to the Board of Pharmacy. Well, the problem is the Board of Pharmacy doesn't have the staff, so then law enforcement has to go out and take action on behalf of the state of Minnesota. But we're not trained to do that. So there's a lot of things that could come into play here. The obviously illegal to possess under 21, which can become problematic. What do we, if we have a situation where an individual who's 18, 19 years old mixes a THC gummy with a CBD seltzer or some other alcoholic content drink and gets involved in a car crash and kills somebody? There's a lot of examples that were used in our League of Minnesota Cities work group to talk about that, and how do we, test for that? How do we put guardrails around that and determine if somebody is under the influence of a edible cannabinoid product? Regulatory agencies don't have adequate staffing or structures in place to enforce, relying on the locals, municipalities to do that. We talked about it going to alcohol, gambling, and enforcement. They don't have the structure in place, so it most likely will be municipalities. And then I talked a little bit about out-of-state products allowed to be sold in Minnesota with no control over THC levels. This was pretty prominent in Oregon. Oregon had a lot of problems with this, talking with their law enforcement out there. The amount of counterfeit products, because the demand and the supply obviously are a concern. And what they found is a lot of the THC products, a lot of edible gummies were produced with THC from marijuana, not from hemp, which caused spikes in some of the THC levels that they had to deal with and caused a lot of problems in those communities out in those states. So right now, the Board of Pharmacy is allowed to license these products, and they have to be approved by a third-party lab. But again, we have concerns about that because these products can be counterfeited. So we want to make sure the products that are sold in Richfield are meeting the requirements in state statute. It'd be beneficial. We're looking at, what other cities are doing, as Jennifer talked about. And I'll turn it over to her for the different options for consideration.
So as I'm sure you've seen in your presentation slides, there's really 4 different options available to cities. And after talking with legal counsel, I'll outline these briefly. The first option is a complete prohibition of THC products. The city could possibly classify THC edibles as an intoxicating cannabinoid and therefore not allowed under the new law. They could also be prohibited under city's authority to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the community. We would need to work with City Attorney Teachin to develop findings that support the dangers of edibles and the need to prohibit them. Option number 2 is a moratorium, which you saw on the slide. Several cities have already enacted. Staff feel that a 6-month to 1-year moratorium gives us time to study the issue, gives us time to watch where other cities are having issues with this, and develop an ordinance that addresses those gaps and issues. The League of Minnesota Cities is supposed to be putting out sample language. We don't anticipate that coming until early 2023. The third option is to license establishments that want to sell these ECPs. We would create an ordinance, an application, a fee structure, and penalties, and license these establishments, much like we do tobacco and alcohol. There would be multiple compliance checks throughout a year. Like the intoxicating liquor license, obviously the privilege of holding this type of license comes with responsibility, and it also comes with heavy oversight from the city, much like an intoxicating liquor license. I suspect that there's going to be heavy product education, background checks. There will be complaints coming in, calls for service, and underage compliance failures. That will add on to the responsibility of public safety staff. Many cities are looking at fees similar to the intoxicating liquor license fees. And those fees would go to cover the responsibilities that I just spoke to for public safety staff. And as you know, I'm sure the League of Minnesota Cities has advised that these products should not be available in liquor stores, and so they cannot be sold within our municipal liquor stores, or any liquor store for that matter. And then the fourth option is to really do nothing. Cities are not required to take any action regulating the products. If they choose not to regulate, the sale and production of the products would be governed by the city's existing regulations. So the new law gives local law enforcement power to enforce violations. But if nothing is done, we wouldn't be doing anything regarding the sale of the products. At this point, we are also unsure of who's already selling them. We know of one convenience store that's selling them, but we don't know if they're legal products. We don't know where the products came from. So a moratorium too would give us time to survey establishments and find out who is selling them. So the chief will talk about staff recommendations next.
So these are our recommendations based upon what we know from the league and talking with other cities and where other cities are at. Again, these are just recommendations, is to implement a moratorium for 6 months, allowing staff time adequately to study the issue. We want to ensure that a robust ordinance is developed for the health and safety and welfare of the community. We want to make sure that developing a separate ordinance specific to Richfield into the new law would license and regulate these new products, like we license and enforce alcohol and tobacco, which Jennifer talked about. Licensing products. This was a big issue in the league's work group, is licensing establishments wanting to sell edible cannabinoid products. There's a lot of questions that we have to consider. What businesses should be allowed to sell products? In some jurisdictions, they handled it by zoning, where only tobacco stores could handle and sell CBD products, or excuse me, edible cannabinoid products. And so they handled it with a zoning issue. Some left it open to the number of establishments who can sell it by licensing them, but also capping the number of licenses that the city has available. We look at online sales. That was an issue that was out in Colorado and out in Oregon. How do you regulate that? The age of person selling product. Some cities have it where they have to be 21 plus to sell the product. Some cities have it where you only have to be 18 to sell the product, but if you can't possess it when you're 18 years old, should you be selling the product? So those are questions. Is it a permanent site? Some cities have looked at kiosks. They've looked at other vending machines, whether or not we allow those to be in the community. Again, under 21, is it a petty misdemeanor? Do we do nothing? Is it a misdemeanor? What do we look at for those that are in violation, that are in possession of an edible cannabinoid? But also whether people want to sell it due to liability and cost. Some communities in the League of Minnesota Cities work group found that a lot of retailers did not want to sell it. One, because of the unknown of where the statute is at right now and the legalities that are placed upon them. And probably did not want to dive into it until some of the statutory language is cleaned up and there's more guardrails put on it to get in that product. There were also concerns of obviously counterfeiting products and bringing products in from out of state and what liability that they would have doing that. So again, looking at an ordinance that would fit the city of Richfield's needs and tailor our community needs going forward. So right now, that's been a lot of information in a short period of time, so we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Questions or comments from council? Councilmember Troutman.
Thank you, Jay and Jennifer. I have a ton of questions, but first two questions, moratorium. Would the or not the moratorium, but the ban, would that ban just the sale, or would that ban the sale and the possession of, when it talked about that as an option, are those two sub options, or is a ban one or the other?
I would refer to Mary on that one.
Councilmember Troutman, I can try to answer that, although I'm not aware.
Simon, please.
Simon, sorry. That's going to be hard to get used to. In my research, at least, I'm not aware of other cities that have taken that approach. I don't know, Jay or Jennifer, if you are. At least my initial understanding of that approach was that it would be a prohibition on the sale of the products.
You're correct, Marion. Some of the cities talked about that in the League of Minnesota Cities work group. They talked about maybe just prohibiting it altogether. Most of those cities were outstate cities, but again, it was a large topic of discussion with metro cities as well.
I will say, too, that I'm taking that approach. I think we have to be pretty cautious and really study we'd have to put together a very detailed ordinance with findings to support that, because this is a legal product. And so, I'm not saying it can't be done, I just think it's an approach that we'd really have to look at closely and come up with some pretty ironclad, reasons for taking that approach.
I have more questions, but I can hold them.
Councilmember Supple?
So I'm going to just weigh in with a bunch of opinions here. My main concern is making sure that youth do not get access to this. We have all kinds of things that affect a developing brain as a child is maturing, whether it's nicotine or whether it's alcohol, and THC also can affect a developing brain. So I think one of our primary concerns should make sure that we protect our youth. What a fully mature adult decides to do is a totally different matter. But I do think we want to make sure that we have some time to put those guardrails, as you said, into place. And I'm also would be optimistic in the hopes that maybe the legislature will do something. So I guess I would support that moratorium so we have more time to study, but also to maybe perhaps let the legislature clear up some of the concerns that have come up. But I do think that we need to make sure that we are protecting our youth. So I would support that it should like be behind the counter. Like right now, you don't just go up to a vending machine and buy cigarettes like you used to be able to do 50 years ago. You have to, it's behind the counter when you're buying them. And I know like if I'm in an adult establishment ordering beverages, they can't be delivered by somebody who's not of legal drinking age. So even if the waiter or the waitress is bringing me a glass of wine, they can take the order, but it has to be delivered by someone who's over 21. So I would say, I think that it should be people that are of legal age to buy the product that would be able to be putting it out there. So those are those two things. And then I am concerned about some way to make sure that the products that are being sold aren't being counterfeited. I know there are issues with things being cut into products all the time that can cause safety hazards. So I guess I would support having some kind of a moratorium to study the issue and then eventually looking at ways to license it so that we can protect people that are the youth under the age of 21 from getting hold of it. Because as you said, there are overdose issues, all kinds of things. And so that would be my feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hayford O'Leary.
So just on the moratorium first, I've expressed this in the past, and my mind has not changed, although I appreciate learning of the details that make this administratively difficult. I do not think a moratorium is a helpful approach. I see the problem. I don't see why that's a solution, even for a temporary period of time. In large part because two of our three neighboring cities are continuing to allow the sale of this. Minneapolis, I don't believe intends to do a moratorium. Bloomington has not done so far, although they're going to license. So people can buy, with the haziness around age included, online. They can buy a mile north in Minneapolis. They can buy a mile south in Bloomington. I don't think we're really getting any public safety benefit by making people go a mile out of their way. What we are doing is taking business away from retail businesses, and there's a lot of excitement around this product. There was a lot of excitement around this progress in legalization of THC, and there's a lot of support for that. I think there's a lot of issues here, and I want us to be careful about this, and I agree with the concerns that Mary raised about making sure that we're doing this appropriately. But I think we should just implement that when we're ready to implement that, and I do not believe we should prohibit it until that time, because all we're going to do is get excitement for a new product to go to other businesses and not to our businesses, and I don't think that's helpful. Regarding the licensing, I generally support the idea, particularly of age checks. I'm a little bit concerned about adding so much complexity that our fee has to be so high. Jennifer mentioned as high as an intoxicated liquor fee, that basically nobody would do it and it would be a de facto ban. If it's $10,000 a year, I don't know that any business is going to sell enough of this stuff to make that worth their while. I don't think the margins are going to be that great when they're selling products that have been commercially produced. So I support a sort of limited licensing. I really don't think the moratorium is going to help anything other than hurt our businesses.
Thank you. Other comments, Ben?
Thank you, Maria. I My thought is that getting to the place of licensing feels like the long-term solution. I appreciate kind of both sides of what was just shared. I do think that having licensing be something that is just finding that balance between what is doable is not a ton of extra work on the same number of staff, is not a huge fee on businesses, but does keep the protections we need, with a primary one being the age checks. My question is sort of similar. I don't have an opinion yet, as Sean did, but my question about the moratorium is essentially like, what are we hoping it would accomplish? Is it that we, and I'm sensing that it's maybe multiple of these things. One, I share the concern that even if we can confidently say that they're not being sold in Richfield, there's a bunch of our problems or these concerns that still aren't addressed if people are still using them, possessing them in Richfield. But is the idea that the moratorium gives us time to come up with the licensing infrastructure that we don't yet have? Is it that with a 6-month or especially 1-year moratorium, we would hope the legislature in this next session provides more guidance? Can you just say more of what clearly staff is seeing value in moratorium? If you could say more about that.
Yes, I think for the moratorium aspect of it, what we're seeing a lot of cities do is just cut and paste their tobacco compliance into the edible cannabinoid product licensing structure. From an enforcement standpoint, and when we came out of the league, I think there's a lot of downsides to that. This is a specific product, as has been discussed here. I think the moratorium gives us that time to put forward, if the council chooses to, a licensing structure that's specific to edible cannabinoid products and not just copy the tobacco. With so much unknown at this point, I think staff wants to make sure that we have a licensing structure in place that works for that product and not just cut and paste a tobacco licensing structure or ordinance, which a lot of other cities are doing. And I know Bloomington is moving forward. I think they're waiting a little bit to see what some of the legislature does. But because of the law, there's so many things that are just unknown. Our hope is too that the legislature cleans some of these things up so that when we're ready to license it, we have everything in place that we feel is for the safety and welfare of the community. That's what the moratorium would do. It'd give us time to make sure that we have the best licensing structure in place, and I'll let Jennifer add to that.
Yeah, it's not just the licensing, it's the ordinance development, and quite honestly, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, there's been a lot of draft language that's been shared by cities, and we're learning a lot about what's really important to every city. Every city is very different. We don't have the resources that Minneapolis has. We don't have the resources that Bloomington has. We need to be very specific and focus on what can we do here in Richfield, what makes sense for Richfield, and there's a lot of ideas that are coming through in these staff reports and draft language that we can consider for Richfield, and so that's been really helpful when thinking about eventually what this could look like for our city. That's been a big bonus through this whole learning process. And like the chief spoke, we're really hopeful that the legislature tackles this early on in the year so that we don't need to be revising an ordinance that's put out and then we have to retract it and rework it. I think that's going to be confusing for retailers. And so, yeah, it's just the moratorium would be kind of a good pause to really think this through and come up with an ordinance that really suits our community.
Go ahead, go ahead, Mary.
Thank you. Just a couple follow-up points to Jennifer's comments on the moratorium. So if the council chose to go that route, just to be clear, it can't be a pause and then just to sit and wait to see if the legislature acts later. the city would have to take proactive steps to study the issue and start working on an ordinance and working towards that goal. So that's just a clarification. And then the only other comment on that I wanted to make is that you can have a moratorium up to a year. I would recommend you do that because you can repeal it at any time. It doesn't need to be in place for the full year. So that just would avoid having to extend, that would be my recommendation anyway. The moratorium could be rescinded at any point that you adopted a licensing ordinance, for example, so it wouldn't necessarily be in effect the entire 12 months.
Simon.
Thank you, Maria. Just waiting in with opinions. I hear you when you say that we have a smaller staff and you need some time, and I think it's harder to unring a bell. So once people are already doing something, to then pull it back to just create more conflict and more confusion. I would support, just on your recommendation, the moratorium. I don't think Mary could have said it better. That my concern is not for the senior citizens in my ward, but for kids. And then my second concern that's parallel to that, and kind of the questions about possession, is that I would be really concerned if the fruit of this is adding criminal records for kids in this circumstance, that's also straining our resources. And I think Jay mentioned this, that's also a concern, to spread our resources thinner that way. So I'd just say kids' health, number one, kids' criminal records, number two, moratorium makes a lot of sense for me, especially given our limited resources. Follow-up question with regards to how we would want to license it, if it's like an on-sale liquor license. Is this something that we would make available to restaurants if they wanted to make that available as a part of their, and I see this as different, like I don't see businesses being particularly hurt by not selling, I think they're hurt as our gas stations are, that they can't sell liquor and we don't have a liquor store. Like, it's not a business that we're in, where liquor licenses for restaurants actually disrupt sort of our ability to have small independent restaurants, which is like a different kind of business concern. But I don't know, because it's not, would we offer this in businesses or for restaurants? Would restaurants be able to offer the edible cannabinoid products?
At this point, it's a legal product, and we've had that discussion. Do we limit it to, I think Richfield has now 2 or 3 tobacco-only shops. There are some cities that are limiting it to tobacco shops. There are other cities that are allowing it to be sold at your local bar, at your, if you go get a massage, they might have a small little display on a counter. I think that's a decision that you as a council need to make, is where do you want these products sold?
Sean?
So just one comment I wanted to respond to in terms of putting something out there and then pulling it back. The earliest we would possibly act on this, I believe, is the end of this month, which is 3 months after this became legal. So if we were to do a moratorium, we would be pulling something back that is currently for sale in Richfield. And again, I do want to emphasize this being a new product. I think that's important because people find places they like, they find places they're familiar with, and particularly with a new product, that advise them on the product, that tell them about it. They develop relationships with those businesses, and this is a prime time in which people develop those habits. So it's not just that they're going to lose 6 months of sales, it's that they're going to lose those customers potentially forever to other businesses and to online businesses that are probably going to be able to beat them in price, depending on how much our liquor license fee might add to that, or our future THC license fee. The other question I had, so obviously I'm very familiar with what we do with liquor and age checks and all of that. Okay, what do we do with there's other consumer products that I know I have to show my ID for? I don't know if that's the law or just the businesses choose to. I'm thinking of like spray paint or like computer duster or NyQuil. Do we do age checks for those? Is that the law, or does it just like Target choose to check for IDs for those things?
That's a good question, Sean. I actually wrote the spray paint ordinance back about 20 years ago when we had a lot of graffiti in the community. So they are required to show ID and have to be over a certain age, and we have done compliance checks at Menards and Home Depot and things like that. So some of the other products know that, I mean, there's no compliance check in place, but for like spray paint and things like that, there is.
But with spray paint, we don't license it, it's just, what would happen if they failed their compliance check?
There is a administrative penalty that they would have to pay.
Okay.
I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know offhand what that is. but-
Okay, no, I'm just kind of curious structurally how it works. Is that structure an option for THC? Where rather than proactively licensing, you're,
It possibly could be. I don't know. I haven't seen an administrative fee like that. Most of the communities are doing under tobacco and alcohol.
okay,
Just because of the compliance check and the product itself, it's being handled in local states. And talking with Oregon and Colorado, that's how they do it. They do it through compliance checks and licensing and things like that. And that's been, I think, probably the recommendation from the league is going to probably be local regulation versus state oversight. But I mean, it's too early to tell at this point.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Ben?
I just want to circle back to me, the elephant in the room with a moratorium, and I'm still not sold one way or the other. In terms of like, ultimately, what is the danger, a lot of the dangerous situations of like impaired driving, of potential overdose, of unlicensed or not, of counterfeit products or things that have higher levels. All of those are connected to possession and use, which is not something the moratorium would really, I think, make a strong impact on. And so I guess I'm wondering, say we do follow through on a moratorium and are working towards some kind of long-term licensing, like keeping tabs on what other cities are researching and pushing for at the legislature. I guess, what do we do in the short term on the dangers related to possession and use? And does a moratorium help those at all?
Well, from that perspective, Ben, I think when we looked at the moratorium, it would obviously stop the sales of the product. Right now in law enforcement, if anybody's in possession, there's no way for us to tell if it's a violation because we have no way to test it. And there is no possession crime, so to speak, for anyone purchasing it under 21, even though the state law says you cannot possess it under 21. So that's one of the conversations that we had at the league. It's like, well, why is that written in there if there's no way to enforce it?
I just want to clarify something. I think the law says you can't sell to under 21, but I don't think does the law address possession at all?
No, I'm sorry. Thanks for the clarification, Mary.
Yeah, I think it is currently not illegal for somebody under 21.
Right,
to
currently
possess.
not illegal
Right.
to possess it. But that's the problem. So there's no way for us in law enforcement to be able to enforce that. Not that, we would have to take a look at that from a perspective of whether or not we have the training to determine whether or not that product is illegal, is it not illegal? How do we enforce it from a local perspective? And that's what municipalities are taking a look at.
So do you have your question answered, Ben?
Thank you for circling back. I don't think there is a clear answer, and I saw Sean nodding. I think that's one of the reasons, if I'm hearing correctly, that you are not thinking a moratorium provides a lot of help. I know you typically let us ask questions first, but Maria, I'd be curious what you're thinking, because Mary and Simon are for it. I'm still very much undecided about a moratorium, and Sean's clearly against.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And so from my perspective, I think I'm in support of a moratorium, and I think in terms of the cost benefit analysis and what the focus of the moratorium is, I am in support of it. I would like to get just a better understanding of really clearly laying out what does that mean, what has to happen. As Mary had said, there has to be really clear cut components of that moratorium. That's kind of where I'm wanting to get a little more clarity on it, but I am in support of it. I'm thinking about something that fits for our community, thinking of the concerns in licensing and all of that. And just from what you said, Jay and Jennifer, if people have it right now, the moratorium is not going to affect that. This is something that's legal. So for me, that is, again, it kind of parses out. I understand Sean's concern around the businesses and building that relationship. And to me, that short-term impact for the potential future gain is something that I'm willing to put out there. And I think that the businesses, in our community will do just fine. And so those are the reasons that I'm in support of it, and knowing that regardless, people can have it right now in our community. And right now, the moratorium is not going to affect that component of it. So that's where I stand. Simon?
I just have a quick question, just trying to understand a little bit more about the state of the law. So now for tobacco sales or liquor sales, there's a prohibition for somebody older purchasing for somebody younger. But is there a similar prohibition if it's not unlawful to possess it? If you're under 21, can Big Brother just go and buy edible cannabinoid products for their siblings without any? Is that permissible right now? Okay.
Ben?
At this point, we have 3 supporting a moratorium, so that question seems answered. I guess the opinion I feel most strongly about, and I'm curious if staff have even a guess as a timeline, the most urgent step would seem to be to create a local, and I guess I don't know if this is ordinance, but a local distinction that possession when you're under 21 is some type of crime. I agree with, we don't just want to give a bunch more minors criminal records, but if it's enough of a crime that it could be confiscated, or that you can't literally together walk up to the checkout and then just hand it over as soon as you bought it. Is that one of the things that there are starting to be draft policies? Is that something that could be done sooner, or is that also on the list that could take a full 6 months to a year?
Go ahead, Mary.
I can say, Ben, that I am aware of one city. It's one city we work with. I don't personally, but a colleague of mine, the city of Mankato, actually had this discussion, and they adopted an ordinance because they were very concerned about the issue of possession by minors. And I wish I'd brought a copy of it with me, but I didn't. I think what they did was their ordinance addressed the possession by minors, makes it illegal, but then established a process about what would happen if they discovered minors in possession, where they would confiscate the products, they would contact parents if that was the situation. I don't remember all the details of the ordinance, but that's how they went at it, because that was one of their major concerns. I'm not aware if they're working on licensing separately or not, but that was one of the first things they did, was this ordinance where they specifically addressed the possession by minors to deal with that.
Other comments or questions? Simon?
I'd just say that I think that's great, and that kind of addresses more of my concerns than the businesses. Especially, it just seems like if we don't have a tool that does that, an aspiring 22-year-old just sits outside of any dispensary and just takes a little handling fee to do that and it's lawful. And so I think that's great that we could maybe address that, but not just create, 1,000 more, drug-oriented criminal records for folks. It doesn't seem fruitful. So I'm really, thank you for sharing that, Mary.
Other comments or questions? Sean?
I did say it before, I will just reiterate, as we look towards licensing, likely after a moratorium now, keeping the cost down and having that be appropriate, that is not, first off, do we even want to encourage people to go solely to tobacco shops? And I don't know, it seems like you might actually prefer people buy those in convenience stores and not be going to tobacco stores. But regardless, I'd like to look at ways we can keep that as affordable as possible while still making sure you're hitting your public safety benefits. I'm particularly a little bit skeptical of the idea of like trying to test products. That seems like it'd be very expensive and difficult for the city to get into the business of.
That's a good point, Sean, that you brought up. In my conversations with Oregon and Colorado, the fact that Minnesota does not have testing protocol in place, we would have to go to private labs and outsource it, and that can be $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 to test products. So that's why we're really putting the emphasis on the state to come up with testing protocols for the product in general, for the regulations, but also for law enforcement.
I know we have a few minutes before our city council meeting, so I'm wondering if someone on staff can talk about what's next steps and further outlining based on the conversation today.
Yep, as was mentioned, the moratorium doesn't provide us a 6-month sit-back period and do nothing. We are actively working and looking at draft resolutions. It's a menu of options right now, and we can pick and pull and work with Mary on getting language together. A lot of cities have shared their staff reports, their draft language, their work session presentations. So we're working on it already, just in preparation for whatever was decided this evening. So, as far as a timeline, we'll make work whatever you want. But I know Mary's busy with other cities and working on those drafts too. So I don't know that I can pinpoint a specific time, but just to say we are actively working on it. And when we think we've got a really good, solid sample ordinance for you to consider, I think we're down to 1 meeting in December. I think we've got 2 meetings in November. And then the new year.
The moratorium is quite straightforward to put together. We've done it for several cities. That's not going to be necessarily unique. That's more of a standard sort of thing. So that could be brought to the council as soon as the next council meeting, if the council wishes, is directing staff to do that. So that's something that can be done fairly quickly.
Ben?
I just realized I would love to hear from the others on council. I know sometimes one of us says something and the rest of us silently are like, that's good, and then we don't actually affirm. Is the rest of council interested in what I was describing of prioritizing a ordinance or whatever the proper channel is, but something around minor possession, prioritizing that over the business licensing research and drafting? And trying to make that answer that question as quickly as possible.
Feedback. I feel I don't know if you can you prioritize one over the other, because will they have to both be in the same ordinance, or how would that work, I guess?
Much like tobacco ordinances across the state, purchase, use, and possession, PUP, has typically been embedded in those ordinances. It puts the blame on big tobacco and not on youth. So a lot of communities don't enforce if kids are in possession of tobacco, even though they really shouldn't. It's not good for them. But that would be embedded into the ordinance language. So it would all be considered at the same time. It's, do you want that in the ordinance language? Yes or no, and we can put that in. Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you to our staff for your work and your research on yet another item of the long list of unprecedented things that you're exploring and looking at. So thank you so much. And I will adjourn our work session.